David pulled his hybrid car into the driveway, exhaling a long sigh as he shut off the engine and leaned back against the headrest, relishing the brief silence after a day filled with relentless meetings and lines of complex code. The weight of unresolved logic and lingering errors clung to his thoughts, refusing to dissipate even as he finally arrived home. The dim glow of the streetlights cast elongated shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood, and the warm amber light spilling from his living room window was a silent welcome. But as he opened the car door and stepped onto the driveway, something at the edge of his property caught his eye. A small, worn-out backpack lay partially concealed behind the hedge near his front yard, its faded fabric barely visible in the soft light. It wasn't his, and as far as he knew, it didn't belong to anyone who lived in the neighborhood. A flicker of unease settled in his chest, but curiosity took hold as he cautiously approached, his sneakers brushing against the cool pavement. As he neared, his gaze shifted, and that was when he saw her. Huddled against the side of his house, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. Her small frame curled into itself, arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if trying to disappear. Strands of unkempt blonde hair hung over her face, her clothes too thin for the evening chill, and smudges of dirt clung to her skin like the remnants of a long, exhausting journey. The dim light from the porch illuminated her delicate features, and in that moment, David's breath caught in his throat. The girl stirred, sensing his presence, and her eyes flicked up to meet his. There was no immediate relief, no recognition of safety, only a guarded, wary expression mixed with something deeper: fear, fatigue, a quiet defiance that suggested she had learned, perhaps too young, that trust was dangerous. David crouched down slowly, keeping his movements measured, his voice soft yet deliberate. "Hey there," he said gently. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. Instead, her small fingers clutched at the oversized hoodie she wore, gripping the fabric as if bracing for something worse. David could feel the hesitancy rolling off her in waves, a silent struggle playing out behind those tired blue eyes. She was afraid of him, afraid of what he might do or what he might say. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Had someone abandoned her here? Was she lost? But he knew pressing her for answers wouldn't help. Not yet. He glanced at the backpack lying nearby, its straps frayed, the material worn down from use. It was all she had. His chest tightened at the thought. Carefully, he sat down on the pavement a few feet away, making sure not to invade her space. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to coax her closer. Instead, he simply existed in the moment, allowing her to see that he wasn't a threat. The night air carried the distant hum of crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. After a long silence, David spoke again, his voice steady. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but if you're cold, I have a warm house right there." He nodded toward his front door. "And some food if you're hungry." The girl blinked but didn't respond, her fingers still gripping the hoodie. David didn't push. He had seen this kind of fear before. Not in a child, but in people who had been through too much, people who had learned to expect the worst. If he pushed too hard, she would run. If he did nothing, she might disappear before morning, back into whatever darkness had led her here. He wasn't sure which option was worse. So instead of pressing, he simply sat there, waiting, hoping that somehow, in this quiet stretch of time, she might see what he already knew. She wasn't alone anymore. The flashing red and blue lights painted shifting patterns across the front of David's house, casting long, restless shadows over the driveway. He stood by the door, his posture controlled, his expression composed but undeniably weary. Across the yard, Linda stood with her arms crossed, her lips pulled into a tight, self-righteous line as she pointed toward him. "I saw everything," she declared, her voice carrying through the night air like a siren of accusation. "He took that child into his house. It looked suspicious. I had no choice but to call the police." David inhaled slowly, grounding himself against the frustration bubbling in his chest. He had anticipated resistance, had known from the moment Linda moved into the neighborhood watch committee that she would see him as someone who didn't belong. But this This was a new low even for her. The officer, a tall man with a solid frame and sharp eyes, stepped forward, his uniform crisp under the glow of the streetlights. The name on his badge read Rodriguez, and though his posture was firm, there was no immediate hostility in his expression. Just caution, just the carefully measured approach of a man who had been in situations like this before. "Sir," he began, voice even, "we got a call about a possible case of child endangerment. Would you mind explaining what's going on?" David nodded, his fingers tightening slightly at his sides before he forced himself to relax. He knew how this worked. One wrong move, one hint of agitation, and the situation could spiral beyond his control. "Of course, officer," he said, keeping his voice steady. "The girl showed up here tonight. She was outside, alone in the cold. I didn't know who she was or where she came from, but she was clearly scared and hungry. I let her inside so she could warm up. That's all." Linda scoffed, shaking her head. "You expect me to believe that? A strange child just happens to show up on your property, and you decide to bring her inside? Without calling the police first?" David turned to her, his patience thinning. "And what would you have done, Linda? Left her out there? Pretended not to see her?" The officer lifted a hand, cutting off the brewing argument. "Is the child still inside?" David hesitated, glancing toward the house. He knew the girl was scared. Scared of strangers, scared of being taken away, scared of whatever had driven her to end up here in the first place. But there was no avoiding it now. He sighed and nodded. "Yes, but please, she's frightened. If we're going to talk to her, it needs to be done gently." Rodriguez studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "All right, let's do this the right way." David stepped back, opening the door, and immediately felt the small presence hiding just behind it. The girl had been listening. Her thin frame trembled slightly as she pressed herself against the wall, eyes darting between David and the officer. There was no mistaking the sheer panic flickering across her face. David crouched down beside her, keeping his voice low. "Hey, it's okay. This is Officer Rodriguez. He just wants to talk. All right?" The girl didn't move, didn't blink. Her hands fisted into the fabric of her hoodie, her breath coming out in quick, shallow gasps. Rodriguez, to his credit, didn't push. He knelt as well, making himself smaller, less imposing. "Hey there," he said, voice softer than before. "I know this is scary, but we just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me your name?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, barely above a whisper, the girl murmured, "Lily." David exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. A name. It was a start. Rodriguez nodded encouragingly. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. Can you tell me where you live?" Lily's fingers curled tighter into her hoodie, her shoulders hunching. "Nowhere," she whispered. David felt something deep inside him crack. Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but his voice softened even more. "Do you have a family, sweetheart? Parents?" Lily swallowed hard. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Mom's gone." David's stomach turned. Rodriguez's jaw tightened, but he remained gentle. "Gone where?" Lily's eyes flickered toward the ground. She got sick. Then she didn't wake up." Linda, who had been watching with folded arms, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Rodriguez let out a slow breath, nodding as if he had pieced together more than Lily had said. "I'm sorry, kiddo," he murmured. "That must have been really hard." Lily didn't respond, but the way her body sagged just slightly, as if finally giving in to exhaustion, told David that it had been harder than words could ever describe. The officer turned back to him. "We need to get Child Protective Services involved," he said quietly, but David could already see the hesitation in his eyes. They both knew what the system was like. Overcrowded, underfunded, often failing the children it was meant to protect. And Lily? She didn't need bureaucracy. She needed safety. She needed warmth. She needed someone who gave a damn. David took a deep breath, the decision settling in his bones before he even spoke. "She can stay here tonight," he said firmly. "At least until we figure out a better option." Rodriguez studied him, considering before finally nodding. "All right," he said, "but I'll be checking in." Linda let out a quiet huff but didn't argue. As the officer returned to his car, the flashing lights disappeared, leaving only the soft glow of the porch light and the quiet of the night. Lily, still clutching her hoodie, looked up at David with something almost like disbelief. "You're not sending me away?" she asked hesitantly. David shook his head. "Not if I can help it." For the first time, however brief, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Something fragile, something hesitant, but unmistakably real. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards as David moved through the kitchen, carefully placing a cup of hot cocoa in front of Lily. She sat at the small dining table, her small hands gripping the warm ceramic as if afraid it might disappear. The oversized hoodie swallowed her frame, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. David leaned against the counter, watching her with an expression caught between concern and something deeper, something unspoken. The night's events had settled into a strange kind of stillness, the storm of flashing lights and accusations now a memory lingering in the corners of the room. Rodriguez had left, but not without a warning. "I'll have to report this," he'd said, his voice measured, almost reluctant. "CPS will follow up. You know how this works." David had only nodded, the weight of that reality pressing against his ribs. He did know how it worked. He knew it far too well. Lily took a tentative sip of the cocoa, her eyes darting toward him before looking back down at the dark liquid swirling in the cup. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Not yet. It was a silence filled with caution, with questions neither of them was quite ready to ask. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not like them." David tilted his head slightly. "Like who?" She hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "The ones that pretend to care." David felt something tighten in his chest, an old, familiar ache. He didn't push her to explain. He didn't have to. He understood more than she could possibly know. His gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the far wall, the one he rarely allowed himself to linger on. It was a picture taken on a bright summer day, the kind of day where the sunlight felt like gold and the laughter never seemed to end. A woman stood beside him, her dark hair catching the light, her eyes full of warmth. His wife, or at least she had been. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to look away. The past had a way of creeping in when he least expected it, wrapping around his thoughts like ivy impossible to pull free. He had spent years trying to bury the grief, to keep it locked behind the walls he had built so carefully. But tonight, those walls felt thinner than usual. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice quieter now, more introspective. Lily glanced up, curiosity flickering across her tired features. "Who?" David hesitated for only a moment before answering. "My wife." The words felt heavy, heavier than they should have, but once they were out, there was no taking them back. He saw the flicker of surprise in Lily's eyes, as if she hadn't expected him to share anything about himself. Maybe she was used to people keeping their distance, keeping their lives separate from hers. "She was like you," David continued, his fingers idly tapping against the countertop. "She grew up without a home, bouncing between foster families, never knowing if she'd stay in one place for more than a few months. She used to tell me that the hardest part wasn't being hungry or being cold, it was feeling invisible, like she didn't matter." Lily didn't say anything, but her grip on the cup tightened. David let out a quiet breath. Someone took her in eventually, gave her a chance. She always said that if it weren't for them, she never would have had a real shot at life. She never forgot what that kindness meant. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet wasn't empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something fragile but real. Then, barely above a whisper, Lily murmured, "Where is she now?" David felt the familiar ache return, sharp and unrelenting. He swallowed against it, forcing himself to meet Lily's gaze. "She's gone," he said simply. "Car accident. A few years ago." Lily's expression didn't change, but he saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the ceramic. Loss was a language she understood. "I'm sorry," she said, and it was the first time she had said something that wasn't purely out of fear or self-preservation. It was the first time she had acknowledged him not as a stranger, not as a possible threat, but as a person. David managed a small, sad smile. "Yeah, me too." Another silence settled between them, but this time, it felt different. Less like two strangers waiting for the other to speak, and more like an understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of pain, of survival, of the strange ways life brought people together. David ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "Look, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but for tonight you're safe here. You don't have to be afraid." Lily stared at him for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether she could believe him. Then slowly she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days following the incident with the police were strangely quiet. David had expected more hostility, more whispers, perhaps even another confrontation from Linda, but instead, there was only silence. The usual morning routine of watching her meticulously tend to her flower beds or wave curtly to passing neighbors had vanished. Her car remained parked in the driveway, and the once frequent sight of her standing by her front porch, eyes scanning the street as if she were a self-appointed sentry, was absent. It was as if she had disappeared into the walls of her own home, retreating from the neighborhood she had once presided over with an unshakable presence. David should have felt relieved, but instead, there was an odd weight in his chest. He wasn't someone who held grudges, and though he had every reason to resent her, he found himself wondering if Linda Thompson was, in some way, struggling with the events of that night just as much as he was. Lily had settled in quicker than he expected. She wasn't completely at ease. There were still moments where she hesitated before reaching for food at the dinner table, still nights when she curled into the corner of the couch rather than her bed, as if afraid that comfort was something temporary, something that could be taken away. But there were also glimpses of something else, something fragile but growing: trust. She no longer flinched when he walked into a room, no longer watched him with the quiet suspicion of someone waiting for disappointment. And then, one evening, as he was washing dishes, she had murmured, barely above a whisper, "This is the first time I've slept in a real bed in a long time." The admission had nearly broken him. It was on the fourth day after the incident that the knock came. David wasn't expecting visitors, and certainly not her. Linda stood at his doorstep, her posture stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. She held a large paper bag in her hands, and though she didn't meet his eyes, she didn't look away either. She hesitated, shifting the weight of the bag. "I brought some things. Clothes, a few extra blankets, and some food. I thought..." She exhaled sharply, cutting herself off as if she couldn't quite find the words. David stared at her for a long moment. This was not the same woman who had stood in his driveway, face twisted with suspicion and indignation. Something had changed. After a beat, he stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come in." She hesitated again, but then, slowly, she did. The living room was warm, lit by the soft glow of the lamp on the side table. Lily was curled up on the couch with a book, her small fingers tracing the edge of the pages as she read. When she saw Linda, she stiffened slightly, her body going still. Linda set the bag down on the kitchen counter, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. She cleared her throat. "I thought about what you said, and I guess I've been wrong about a lot of things." David studied her carefully. There was discomfort in her voice, an unfamiliarity with humility, as if she had spent her entire life being certain of things and now, for the first time, was questioning them. "You don't have to explain," he said gently. Linda looked down, fingers tapping against the counter. "No, I do," she muttered. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know. I don't think you're a bad man. I think I let myself believe things that weren't true because it was easier than looking at myself." David didn't say anything for a long time. The weight of those words settled between them, something unspoken but understood. Finally, Linda turned her gaze toward Lily. Her expression softened in a way David had never seen before. "She's a good kid," she said quietly. Lily blinked, surprised by the directness of the statement. For the first time, she met Linda's gaze head-on. David exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Yeah, she is." Linda reached into the bag, pulling out a folded sweater. "It might be a little big," she said, placing it on the couch beside Lily. "But I figured it's better than nothing." Lily hesitated, glancing between the sweater and Linda. Then, after a long pause, she picked it up, running her fingers over the fabric. "Thank you," she murmured. Linda gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, David felt something shift. Not just within Linda, but within the space between them all. He wasn't sure if it was forgiveness or redemption, or just the simple acknowledgement that people could change, even when they least expected it. That evening, after Linda left, David and Lily sat in the living room, the small Christmas tree they had set up earlier twinkling in the corner. The soft sound of a holiday jazz record played in the background, filling the house with warmth. Lily was quiet, watching the lights reflect in the window, her fingers absently tugging at the sleeve of the sweater Linda had given her. David leaned back against the couch, exhaling softly. "You okay?" Lily nodded. "Yeah." Then, after a moment, she added, "Do you think she meant it?" David glanced at her. "Meant what?" Lily shrugged slightly, pulling her knees up to her chest. "That she's sorry." David considered the question for a long time before answering. "I think people don't always know how to say sorry the right way," he admitted. "But sometimes what matters is that they try." Lily was quiet, mulling over his words. Then she nodded just once. And for the first time in a long while, David felt something settle in his chest. Not the weight of grief or loss or loneliness, but something softer. Something like hope.